Hi, my name is Tom Gross, and the name of my study is School Delinquency and Suspensions, Individual, Peer, and Parenting Mediation Tests. The reason we conducted this study was because we know that school delinquent acts, such as breaking rules, harming others, or property destruction, can result in being suspended from school. What we also have found in literature is that problematic parenting practices, such as inconsistent discipline, poor supervision, parent-child conflict, and parent substance use can also predict suspensions. Further, peer relationships, both positive or negative, can also predict suspension risk. However, what we don't know is on the pathway from school delinquency to suspensions, if those parent and peer relationships can influence the likelihood or trajectory towards suspensions. Therefore, the purpose of the study was to examine if problematic parenting practices predict school suspensions, if peer relationships, both positive and negative, predict school suspensions, and then lastly, if school delinquency predictions for suspensions are mediated by problematic parenting or peer relationships. Again, that's saying on the way from school delinquency to suspensions, do these relationships influence the odds of being suspended? Our participants were 321 low-income urban parent-child dyads, and they were located in the Pacific Northwest. Parents and children completed questionnaires at the middle and end of 8th grade. If we're looking at our demographics data, we can see that we have a diverse sample. Additionally, we can note that our families, or a large portion of our families, are facing financial constraints. For measures, as far as suspensions go, we had two groups, kids who had no suspensions and kids who had any number of suspensions. For school delinquency, we had students self-report the number of school delinquent acts they committed. And then for mediating latent variables, and what we mean by latent variables is that we can combine a bunch of measures together to represent a bigger idea. We had problematic parenting, and then positive and negative peer relationships. Problematic parenting was represented by the Alabama Parenting Questionnaire, or APQ, Inconsistent Discipline Scale, the APQ Poor Supervision Scale. We also had a Family Conflict Scale and Effective Drug or Alcohol Use Scale. As far as positive peer relationships go, we use the Social Competency Scale Pro-Social Skills Subscale, which tells us the number of social skills kids have, and the Strengths and Difficulty Questionnaire, or SDQ, Pro-Social Scale, which tells us the frequency with which kids use their social skills. As far as negative relationships, we have the SDQ Peer Problem Scale, which indicates how often kids have interaction difficulties with their peers. And then we have the Peer Rejection Scale, which assesses how isolated a kid feels at school. We included things called covariates. Covariates are things that we know are associated with or strongly predict an outcome. In this case, we included gender, so either being a girl or a boy, because we know that boys are at greater risk for being suspended. We also included a race variable, which was coded as African American or non-African American, because we also have seen in the literature that being identified as African American increases the odds of being suspended. Our primary analysis was something called the nested logistic regression. And what we do in that is we put together two ideas. We put all our variables in to predict. And so we say gender, race, school delinquency, problematic parenting, positive and negative peer relationships, come on in. But for our first step, we're going to tell the parenting and peer relationship variables to not predict anything, to pretend like you don't have any influence on the outcome. And so we can just see the influence of gender, race, and school delinquency. Then in our next step, or next model, we tell all the variables, including problematic parenting, positive and negative peer relationships, to predict as they will. Now, what we then do is look to see which model fit the data better. That is, which model best represents what's actually going on within the data set. What we found was that model 2, where everything predicted outcomes, fit better. But what we saw in our first model was that school delinquency predicted suspensions, or that every school delinquent behavior a kid committed doubled the chance of being suspended. However, in Model 2, what we found is that school delinquency stopped predicting suspensions. And so when we're looking at this giant figure, this is our second model, or a model with everything predicting. What we'll see is that on each one of these paths, or these arrows, we have a coefficient, and then inside the parentheses, what we have is something called an odds ratio, which is represented by that OR. Our coefficient has some stars next to it. The more stars, the more statistically significant, or the more we can bank on that prediction happening. Now that odds ratio, every amount above 1 is a % higher chance. So for gender, if you're a boy, you have a 285% chance of being suspended over girls. Now with our race variable, that 3.39 tells us that if you're identified as African American, you have a 239% greater chance of being suspended. Now when we look at school delinquency in this model, that odds ratio is 1.25, or 25% better chance. But here's the deal. Because that coefficient is statistically non-significant, we don't know if that's actually likely to occur by chance or if it's a thing that we can bank on. And so for us, we're looking at that result is just happening by chance. Now what we do find is that problematic parenting directly predicts if a child is going to be suspended from school or not. In fact, every point you go up on problematic parenting, the child's odds of being suspended go up 129%. Here's the other thing though, with both positive and negative peer relationships, we don't have statistically significant increases or decreases in suspensions. What we do find though, is that we have a mediation effect. What that means is that we want to follow this dashed red line. So on the way from school suspension, or excuse me, on the way from school delinquency to being suspended, if you have a parent who's engaging in problematic parenting behaviors, that's what really drives the risk for suspension. So what does that mean? One, school delinquency is fully mediated for these individuals by problematic parenting. So if a kid is committing delinquent acts at school and on their way to being suspended, their parent exhibits more problematic parenting behavior, that's really what's going to likely tell us if a kid's suspended or not. Next, we saw that peer relationships don't actually tell us much about being suspended from school. What does that mean? That means that, maybe peers have less of an impact. We were actually kind of shocked by this because we thought peers would have a stronger impact than parents, given that this is the end of 8th grade, and as adolescents get older, they seem to be less reliant on parents and more reliant on peers. However, when we want to think of this more broadly, if we want to understand how to perhaps prevent school suspensions, one of the things that we might want to look at is engaging parents when kids start exhibiting school delinquent behaviors. That is, provide them with ways to understand how consistent discipline and adequate supervision, as well as getting along with their kid, may in fact reduce their child's chance of being removed from school. Further, other things like if we detect parent substance use or abuse, we may want to help parents get in contact with community resources. Thank you very much for listening to my presentation. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me. My email is thomas.gross@WKU. Thank you for listening again.